These young faces on screen should be in yearbooks and graduation photos. Instead, they're in police mug shots. For the most shocking murders in recent history, 15-year-old Carly Gregg has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for killing her mother and trying to kill her stepfather. She wound up beating her grandmother to death. Essentially, her grandma was bludgeoned to death, smiling for the cameras after stabbing her mom 79 times. In 2024, teenage boys dominated headlines for school shootings and gang violence. But what about the girls? The ones we assume are naturally nurturing, incapable of calculated violence, protected by their youth and gender from our darkest suspicions. The truth is more chilling than any horror movie. Since 2013, teenage girls have committed some of America's most brutal family annihilations, executing their own mothers, torturing elderly grandmothers, and orchestrating massacres that left entire communities in shock. Most people assume teenage girls don't kill, that hormones make them dramatic, not deadly. But what? Crimes are so heinous that 14-year-old children receive life sentences without parole. What drives these final moments? When innocence dies and monsters are born. Here are the teenage girls who shattered every assumption about youth, gender, and evil, their crimes, their sentences, and the moments that destroyed everything we believed about childhood innocence. Sofia Koval. Music, Sofia Koval, Florida, May 23, 2024. The crime, beating 79-year-old grandmother to death with her bare hands. Koval made history as one of the youngest to face adult charges for killing a family member. Her chilling statement haunting investigators. She was already dying. I helped her die. Sofia Koval was supposed to be a success story. A 14-year-old Ukrainian refugee who had escaped the horrors of war only to find safety and love in America with her father and grandmother. Instead, she became one of the most disturbing examples of how trauma doesn't always create victims. Sometimes it creates monsters. Sofia had arrived in the United States as part of the massive Ukrainian refugee crisis, fleeing a homeland torn apart by Russian invasion. Her father, desperate to give his daughter a better life, had managed to secure asylum and bring Sofia to Florida, where she would live with him and his elderly mother, 79-year-old Yevgenia Koval. To the outside world, Sofia appeared to be adapting well to American life. She enrolled in school, began learning English, and seemed to be building relationships with other refugee children in the Lauderdale Lakes community. Her father worked multiple jobs to support the family, grateful for the chance to rebuild their lives in peace. But beneath the surface, Sofia was struggling with behavioral issues that her father attributed to war trauma. She had witnessed violence in Ukraine, been separated from her mother during the chaos of evacuation, and experienced the psychological displacement that affects millions of refugee children worldwide. On May 23, 2024, Sofia's father made a decision that would cost his mother her life. Frustrated with Sofia's increasingly defiant behavior and her obsession with her cell phone, he confiscated the device as punishment. It was a normal parental response to teenage rebellion, except Sofia wasn't a normal teenager. Her father left Sofia alone with her grandmother while he went to visit a friend, trusting that the elderly woman would be safe with her granddaughter. It was a decision that haunts him to this day. Yevgenia Koval had survived the Soviet purges, lived through World War II, and endured decades of hardship in Ukraine. She had fled her homeland in her final years, hoping to spend her remaining time in peace with her family. Instead, she would die at the hands of her own granddaughter in a senseless act of rage. What happened in that Lauderdale Lakes apartment between approximately 11 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. remains partially unknown, as Sofia has provided conflicting accounts of the events. What is certain is that during those 90 minutes, 79-year-old Yevgenia was brutally beaten to death by her 14-year-old granddaughter. When Sophia's father returned home at 12:30 a.m., he found his mother unresponsive on the floor, her body covered in bruises and contusions that indicated a prolonged and savage beating. The elderly woman, who had survived war, persecution, and displacement, had been killed by someone she loved and trusted completely. During police interrogation, Sophia displayed a level of emotional detachment that shocked even experienced detectives who had interviewed teenage offenders before. When asked about the beating that had killed her grandmother, Sophia showed no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of her actions, and no recognition of the life she had taken. Her statement to police became one of the most chilling confessions in recent Florida criminal history. She was already dying. I helped her die. The casual, matter-of-fact way she described ending her grandmother's life suggested either severe psychological damage or a fundamental lack of empathy that defied explanation. Sophia seemed to view her grandmother's death not as murder, but as a mercy killing, as if the elderly woman's natural aging process justified Sophia's decision to end her life through violence. The statement revealed a twisted logic that treated her grandmother like a suffering animal rather than a human being deserving of dignity and natural death. The Lauderdale Lakes community, which had welcomed Ukrainian refugees with open arms, was devastated by the revelation that one of the children they had tried to help had committed such a horrific crime. The case challenged assumptions about refugee children and trauma responses, forcing difficult conversations about how communities can better identify and address warning signs. Local schools and social services began reviewing their protocols for supporting refugee children, recognizing that trauma can manifest in unexpected and dangerous ways. The case became a tragic reminder that good intentions and humanitarian impulses must be paired with professional psychological support and monitoring. 14-year-old Sophia Koval openly prayed in court as she waited for her case to be called. Sophia Koval. Her father also in court with help from a Ukrainian interpreter. The teen stands accused of second-degree murder for allegedly beating her grandmother to death. Despite her age, Sophia was charged as an adult due to the severity of the crime and the vulnerable nature of her victim. Florida law allows for adult charges in cases involving particularly heinous crimes, even when committed by juveniles. The prosecution argued that Sophia's actions showed premeditation and a fundamental understanding of right and wrong, making her accountable for her grandmother's death, regardless of her age or trauma history. They pointed to her calm demeanor after the killing and her lack of remorse as evidence of her culpability. Sophia's defense team struggled to explain their client's actions, pointing to her war trauma, displacement, and the psychological effects of being separated from her mother. However, they were unable to present compelling evidence that these factors excused the brutal murder of an innocent elderly woman. Last day of freedom. Sophia spent her final hours as a juvenile in a regular detention cell eating standard facility food. Final statement. She was already dying. I helped her die. The sentence 3 years in juvenile detention followed by deportation to Ukraine. A punishment that sparked outrage from victims' rights advocates who argued it was insufficient for beating an elderly woman to death. Carly Gregg. What's the location of your emergency? I went too far away. I don't know what happened. My wife was dead. My daughter tried to shoot me. Your daughter tried to shoot you? Shooting at me. Carly Gregg, Mississippi. March 19, 2024. The crime execution-style murder of mother and attempted murder of stepfather. Gregg became one of the youngest in Mississippi history to receive life without parole. Security footage capturing her unnatural calmness. She planned and executed the killing of the woman who raised her. Carly Gregg was the perfect daughter until she wasn't. At 14, she maintained a 4.00 GPA at Northwest Rankin High School, had never been arrested, and appeared to be every Parents' dream child. But on March 19, 2024, when her carefully constructed facade of perfection began to crumble, Carly chose murder over facing the consequences of her hidden life. To her teachers, classmates, and community members, Carly Gregg embodied academic excellence and teenage potential. She was enrolled in advanced classes, participated in school activities, and seemed destined for college success. Her mother, Ashley Smiley, was a beloved math teacher in the same school district, creating a family image of educational achievement and wholesome values. But Carly had been living a double life that her family was only beginning to discover. Despite her academic success, she had begun experimenting with marijuana and hiding other behaviors that contradicted her perfect student image. The pressure to maintain her reputation while secretly engaging in activities she knew her family would condemn created a psychological strain that would ultimately explode into violence. Ashley Smiley was not just Carly's mother. She was also an educator who understood the importance of accountability and consequences. When she discovered evidence of Carly's drug use, she approached the situation as both a concerned parent and an experienced teacher who had dealt with student behavioral issues throughout her career. March 19, 2024 started as an ordinary Tuesday at Northwest Rankin High School. Carly attended her classes, interacted normally with teachers and students, and gave no indication that she was planning to commit one of the most shocking crimes in Mississippi history. The trouble began when Ashley discovered marijuana paraphernalia in Carly's bedroom during a routine cleaning. For most families, this discovery would lead to difficult conversations, punishment, and efforts to address the underlying issues. For the Gregg family, it would lead to murder. When Ashley confronted Carly about the drug paraphernalia, she expected teenage defiance, tears, or anger. Typical responses from adolescents caught breaking rules. What she didn't expect was that her daughter had already decided that facing consequences was unacceptable and that murder was preferable to accountability. What happened next was captured in horrifying detail by the family security camera system. Footage that would become crucial evidence in Carly's prosecution and a chilling record of how quickly a family disagreement can escalate to murder. At exactly 2:47 p.m., security cameras recorded Carly walking through her house with purpose and deadly intent. She moved calmly toward her parents' bedroom, carrying a firearm hidden behind her back. There was no visible emotion, no signs of rage or psychological break, just cold calculation as she prepared to kill her mother. Ashley Smiley never saw it coming. The woman who had dedicated her life to education and nurturing young minds was executed by her own daughter with 3 gunshots, 2 to the face and 1 to the chin. The precision and close range of the shots suggested that Carly had aimed carefully, ensuring her mother's death rather than simply injuring her. The security footage revealed Carly's unnaturally calm behavior immediately after the murder. Rather than showing panic, remorse, or even surprise at what she had done, Carly moved through the house with the same composure she might show on any other day. She even paused to text on her phone as if killing her mother was just another item to check off her daily to-do list. But Carly wasn't finished with her horrific day. In a move that demonstrated the depths of her psychological disturbance, she decided to share her crime with a friend. She invited a classmate to come over, asking the chilling question, "Have you ever seen a dead body before?" When the unsuspecting friend arrived, Carly led her to Ashley's corpse and showed off her mother's body like some makeup trophy. The friend's shock and horror seemed to amuse rather than concern Carly, who appeared proud of what she had accomplished. This behavior revealed a level of psychological detachment that went beyond typical teenage rebellion or even serious mental illness. Carly seemed to view her mother's death as an achievement worthy of showing off, demonstrating a complete lack of empathy or understanding of the gravity of her actions. When Heath Smiley, Carly's stepfather, returned home from work, he walked into what he thought was his normal family life. Instead, he found himself facing an armed teenager who had already committed murder and was prepared to kill again. Carly positioned herself near the front door and ambushed Heath the moment he entered the house. She shot him in the shoulder, but Heath's physical strength and quick reflexes allowed him to wrestle the gun away from his stepdaughter before she could finish what she had started. Heath's survival meant there would be a witness to testify about Carly's actions and state of mind during the attacks. His testimony would be crucial in demonstrating that Carly's actions were premeditated and calculated rather than the result of a psychological break or temporary insanity. The investigation into Ashley Smiley's murder was aided significantly by the security camera footage that captured Carly's actions in real time. The video evidence made it impossible for the defense to argue that the killing was accidental or the result of a struggle. It clearly showed a deliberate execution carried out by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Additional evidence included text messages, phone records, and witness testimony from the friend who had been shown Ashley's body. The cumulative evidence painted a picture of a teenager who had planned and executed a murder with chilling premeditation. Investigators were particularly struck by Carly's behavior during questioning. She showed no remorse for her mother's death, no concern for her stepfather's injuries, and no recognition that her actions had destroyed multiple lives. Her emotional flatness suggested either severe psychological issues or a level of callousness that defied explanation. Carly's defense team attempted to argue that she was not responsible for her actions due to mental illness, specifically claiming that changes in her medication had affected her judgment and impulse control. They portrayed her as a troubled teenager who had suffered a psychological break rather than a calculated killer. However, the prosecution successfully argued that the security camera footage showed clear premeditation and planning. Carly's calm behavior before, during, and after the murder contradicted claims of temporary insanity or medication-induced psychosis. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before finding Carly guilty of murder and attempted murder. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Carly's intent to kill. Last day of freedom, Carly attended regular high school classes, maintaining her perfect student facade until the moment she decided to kill her mother. Final statement, she sobbed as the life sentence was read, finally showing emotion. The sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole, making her one of the youngest people in Mississippi history to receive such a harsh sentence. Scarlett Jenkinson. Because the information I have received, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder. Scarlett Jenkinson, England, February 11, 2023. The crime, torture. Murder of transgender classmate Brianna Gay. Jenkinson became Britain's youngest female killer in decades. Her handwritten murder plans and torture fantasies revealing a calculated predator hiding behind the face of an ordinary school girl. Scarlett Jenkinson appeared to be exactly what every school administrator hoped for when troubled students transferred into their district. Quiet, polite, and seemingly focused on academic success. But beneath her unremarkable exterior lurked one of the most dangerous teenage predators in British criminal history. A girl whose obsession with violence and torture would culminate in one of the most shocking murders the UK had ever seen. When 15-year-old Scarlett Jenkinson transferred to Bearwood Community High School in Cheshire, England, she presented herself as a typical teenage girl adjusting to a new school environment. Teachers found her to be respectful and academically capable, while classmates saw her as somewhat withdrawn but harmless. What none of them knew was that Scarlett had been spending her free time consuming some of the darkest content available on the internet. She had downloaded dark web browsers specifically to access torture and murder videos that were too extreme for normal websites. She maintained detailed notes about serial killers, their methods, and their motivations, studying real-life monsters like A. dedicated student preparing for exams. Scarlett's bedroom had become a shrine to violence filled with handwritten research about famous killers, torture techniques, and murder scenarios. She had developed an extensive knowledge of forensic countermeasures, victim selection, and disposal methods that would have impressed criminal profilers. Most disturbing of all, she had begun fantasizing about implementing these techniques herself. When Scarlett first encountered Brianna Gay at Bearwood Community High School, she saw more than just a potential friend. She saw the perfect victim. Brianna was 16 years old, transgender, and somewhat isolated from her peers, making her vulnerable to manipulation and less likely to be missed immediately if something happened to her. Brianna was trying to navigate the challenges of being a transgender teenager in a school environment that wasn't always accepting. She was working to build friendships and find her place in the social hierarchy, making her eager to connect with classmates who showed her kindness or interest. Scarlett recognized Brianna's vulnerability and began a calculated campaign to gain her trust. She presented herself as an ally and friend, someone who understood what it felt like to be different or misunderstood. This false friendship allowed Scarlett to study Brianna's habits, learn her schedule, and identify opportunities for violence. What most people didn't know was that Scarlett had already tried to kill Brianna once. Before the fatal attack. Weeks earlier, she had attempted to poison her classmate with an ibuprofen overdose, hoping that Brianna's death would be ruled a suicide and avoid any investigation that might lead back to Scarlett. The poisoning attempt failed when Brianna didn't consume enough of the medication to cause fatal damage. Rather than taking this as a sign to abandon her murderous plans, Scarlett viewed it as a learning experience that helped her refine her approach for the next attempt. Scarlett's willingness to try multiple murder methods demonstrated a level of persistence and calculation that went far beyond typical teenage violence. She wasn't acting in anger or passion. She was methodically working toward a goal of killing another human being for her own psychological satisfaction. On February 11, 2023, Scarlett put her refined murder plan into action with precision that would have impressed military strategists. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating potential problems and developing contingencies that would allow her to complete the killing without being caught. Scarlett began the day by sending innocent-seeming text messages to Brianna about meeting up to hang out and spend time together. These messages established a paper trail that made their meeting appear spontaneous and friendly rather than predatory. Brianna, trusting her friend's intentions, agreed to meet without any suspicion of danger. The most chilling detail of Scarlett's planning was her instruction to Brianna not to buy a return bus ticket for their outing. This seemingly casual suggestion revealed the depth of Scarlett's premeditation. She knew that Brianna wouldn't need transportation home because she would be dead. Scarlett hadn't planned to commit the murder alone. She had recruited her friend Eddie Ratcliffe to participate in the killing, using a combination of manipulation and shared hatred to turn him into an accomplice. Eddie, who was 15 years old, had expressed transphobic views that Scarlett exploited to motivate his participation in the murder. The partnership between Scarlett and Eddie revealed how dangerous ideas can spread between teenagers and escalate into deadly action. Scarlett's violent fantasies provided the plan and motivation, while Eddie's prejudices provided additional justification for targeting Brianna specifically. Together, they had acquired a hunting knife with a 13 cm blade, a weapon specifically chosen for its effectiveness and causing fatal injuries. The knife size and design indicated that they had researched what type of weapon would be most suitable for their planned attack. At 1:53 p.m. on February 11, 2023, Brianna met Scarlett and Eddie at a bus stop near Culchultith Library. Still believing she was meeting friends for a normal teenage outing, they traveled together to Linear Park, a secluded area where Scarlett knew they could commit murder without being interrupted by witnesses or authorities. Once they reached the isolated location, Scarlett and Eddie launched what police would later describe as a frenzied and ferocious attack. They stabbed Brianna 28 times across her head, neck, chest, and back, using the hunting knife to inflict wounds that were designed to cause maximum damage and ensure death. Hello. Need urgent help at this location. Music, we're probably about half a mile, 3/4 a mile from the car park. Female, numerous stab wounds, one to the chest, one to the neck. Brianna fought desperately for her life, her hands and arms showing defensive wounds as she tried to protect herself from the repeated stab wounds. The evidence suggested that she had remained conscious during at least part of the attack, fully aware that her trusted friends were killing her. Even as Brianna lay dying from her injuries, Scarlett was implementing the final phase of her plan. She sent a text message to Brianna's phone asking, "Girl, where are you?" to establish an alibi and make it appear that she was concerned about her friend's whereabouts. This fake text message revealed the depth of Scarlett's calculation and planning. While most people would be in shock after witnessing or participating in such violence, Scarlett was calm enough to execute a cover-up strategy that she had planned in advance. The text also demonstrated Scarlett's complete lack of empathy for her victim. As Brianna died from the wound Scarlett had inflicted, Scarlett was focused entirely on avoiding consequences rather than showing any remorse or concern for the life she had taken. When police searched Scarlett's bedroom following her arrest, they discovered evidence that painted a terrifying picture of a teenager who had been planning violence for months or even years. Her handwritten murder plans included detailed scenarios, victim profiles, and methods for avoiding detection. Most disturbing were Scarlett's notes about taking trophies from victims, physical mementos that would allow her to relive the experience of killing. This behavior is typically associated with serial killers rather than one-time teenage offenders, suggesting that Brianna's murder might have been intended as the first of many. The cache of violent material in Scarlett's possession included research on famous serial killers, torture techniques, and forensic countermeasures. The breadth and depth of her knowledge indicated that she had been studying murder as seriously as other students might study for college entrance exams. Scarlett's trial revealed the full extent of her planning and the calculated nature of Brianna's murder. Prosecutors successfully argued that this was not a case of teenage bullying gone wrong or impulsive violence, but rather a premeditated murder carried out by someone who had been fantasizing about killing for years. The evidence of Scarlett's internet searches, her handwritten plans, and her behavior before and after the murder painted a picture of a teenage predator who had used her ordinary appearance to hide her dangerous obsessions. The judge noted that Scarlett's crimes were among the most serious he had encountered in his career. When Scarlett was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 22 years before possible parole, she showed no emotion or acknowledgement of the gravity of her crimes. Her flat affect and lack of remorse reinforced the prosecution's argument that she was a dangerous individual who felt no empathy for her victims. Last day of freedom, Scarlett attended normal classes at Bearwood Community High School, maintaining her quiet student facade while planning murder. Final statement: she showed no emotion when sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence life imprisonment with a minimum of 22 years before possible parole, making her one of the youngest female killers in British legal history. If you're fascinated by the dark psychology of women who kill, hit that subscribe button for Women of Crime. We uncover the most disturbing female perpetrators that mainstream media won't touch. Because what we're about to reveal next will completely change how you see these cases. A teenage girl who stabbed her mother 79 times while her stepfather listened to the screams. An 18-year-old who executed an entire family, including 2 small children. A master manipulator who convinced her boyfriend to commit murder, then walked free after just a decade. Subscribe now because these final cases will show you that teenage girls can be just as calculating and deadly as any adult killer. Maybe even more dangerous. Because no one suspects them. Isabella Guzman. Isabella Guzman, Colorado, August 28, 2013. The crime: savage stabbing, murder of mother in family bathroom. Guzman became a viral TikTok sensation for her bizarre courtroom expressions. But behind the memes lies one of the most brutal matricides ever recorded. 79 stab wounds inflicted while her stepfather listened to her mother's screams. Isabella Guzman's transformation from troubled teenager to viral internet sensation represents one of the most disturbing examples of how social media can turn real-life tragedy into entertainment. But long before millions of TikTok users were making memes from her courtroom footage, Isabella had committed one of the most savage family murders in Colorado history. By August 2013, 18-year-old Isabella Guzman had been locked in an increasingly volatile relationship with her mother, Yunmihoe, for months. What had started as typical teenage rebellion had escalated into something much more dangerous, with Isabella showing signs of severe mental illness that her family struggled to understand or address. Yuni had immigrated to the United States from South Korea, working hard to build a stable life for her family in Aurora, Colorado. She had married Ryan Hoy, Isabella's stepfather, and together they had tried to provide Isabella with structure, support, and opportunities for success. But Isabella's behavior had become increasingly erratic and threatening. The family dynamics were complicated by Isabella's resentment toward her stepfather and her perception that her mother had chosen her new husband over their mother-daughter relationship. Isabella had begun making accusations that Ryan was controlling or abusive, claims that were not supported by evidence, but reflected her increasingly paranoid worldview. Mental health professionals who later evaluated Isabella would identify signs of schizophrenia that had likely been developing for months or years before the murder. However, the family had not recognized these symptoms as indicators of serious mental illness, instead attributing Isabella's behavior to typical teenage adjustment issues. August 27, 2013, the day before the murder, marked a crucial escalation in the family conflict when Isabella sent her mother an email that should have been recognized as a direct threat. The message contained just 4 words that would later be seen as a clear warning of impending violence. "You will pay." The brevity and directness of the threat reflected Isabella's deteriorating mental state and her growing conviction that her mother deserved punishment for perceived wrongs. The email wasn't a cry for help or an expression of typical teenage anger. It was a declaration of intent from someone who had already decided that murder was justified. Yuni likely received hundreds of emails throughout her life, but this one would be her last. The message represented the final communication between mother and daughter before Isabella would transform from troubled teenager into matricidal killer. August 28, 2013 began as an ordinary evening for the Hoy family. Yuni had finished her workday and was looking forward to a relaxing evening at home with her husband. She had no way of knowing that her daughter had already decided this would be the night she would die. Around 9:30 p.m., Yuni went upstairs for what she thought would be a peaceful shower, a moment of privacy and relaxation after a long day. The bathroom, which should have been a sanctuary in her own home, would become the scene of one of the most brutal murders in Colorado history. Isabella had been waiting for this moment of vulnerability. She knew her mother's evening routine and had identified the shower as the perfect opportunity to strike when Yuni would be alone, undressed, and unable to defend herself effectively. What happened next was so brutal that even experienced homicide investigators struggled to process the crime scene. Isabella attacked her mother with a level of violence that suggested not just intent to kill, but a desire to inflict maximum suffering and destruction. Isabella stabbed her mother 79 times with a kitchen knife, focusing her attack on Uni's face and neck in what forensic experts described as overkill behavior typical of personal rag-driven murders. 31 wounds were inflicted on Yeonmi's face, while 48 more targeted her neck, areas chosen to ensure death while also destroying her mother's identity and humanity. The attack was so sustained and vicious that Ryan Hoy could hear the violence from downstairs. He heard what he later described as thumping sounds and his wife calling his name in terror. But by the time he reached the bathroom, Isabella had transformed her mother from a living person into an unrecognizable corpse. When Ryan finally broke through the bathroom door, he found Isabella standing over Yeonmi's mutilated body, holding the bloody knife that had been used to destroy his wife. The scene was so horrific that it challenged his ability to process what he was seeing. His stepdaughter had literally butchered his wife in their own home. Most shocking was Isabella's behavior in the moments after the murder. Rather than showing shock, remorse, or even surprise at what she had done, Isabella calmly walked past Ryan without speaking. She was covered in her mother's blood, still holding the murder weapon, but she moved through the house as if nothing unusual had happened. Isabella left the house immediately after the murder, apparently believing she could simply walk away from the crime scene and avoid consequences. Her calm departure suggested either complete psychological detachment from reality or a fundamental inability to understand the gravity of what she had done. Isabella was arrested within hours of the murder, found not far from the family home with evidence of her crime still visible on her clothing and body. When questioned by police, she showed the same emotional flatness that had characterized her behavior immediately after the murder. The investigation revealed the extent of Isabella's planning and the personal nature of her attack on her mother. The kitchen knife had been taken from the family's own cutlery, suggesting that Isabella had been contemplating violence using weapons readily available in their home. Crime scene analysis showed that Uni had tried desperately to defend herself, but the confined space of the bathroom and the surprised nature of the attack had made escape impossible. The evidence painted a picture of a terrified woman fighting for her life against her own daughter in the most intimate space of their family home. Following her arrest, Isabella underwent extensive psychological evaluation that revealed evidence of severe mental illness, specifically schizophrenia. Mental health professionals determined that Isabella had been experiencing delusions and paranoid thoughts that had gradually transformed her perception of her mother from loving parent to dangerous enemy. The diagnosis explained some aspects of Isabella's behavior, including her belief that violence against her mother was justified and her apparent lack of remorse for the killing. However, it also raised complex questions about criminal responsibility and the extent to which mental illness could excuse such extreme violence. Isabella's case became a focal point for discussions about the intersection of mental health and criminal justice, particularly regarding young adults whose psychiatric conditions may not be fully recognized or treated before they commit violent crimes. Years after the murder, Isabella gained unexpected notoriety when footage from her court appearances was shared on TikTok and other social media platforms. Users created memes and commentary about her unusual facial expressions and behavior during legal proceedings, turning her into a dark internet celebrity. The viral attention surrounding Isabella's case raised troubling questions about how social media transforms real tragedies into entertainment. Millions of people viewed clips of Isabella's courtroom appearances without understanding the brutal reality of Yoon Mi-hoi's murder or the devastating impact on her family. The memes and viral content trivialized one of the most savage family murders in recent history, demonstrating how internet culture can strip away the humanity of both victims and perpetrators in favor of superficial entertainment value. Last day of freedom. Isabella spent her final 3 hours in escalating conflict with her mother, culminating in the threatening email. Final statement: found not guilty by reason of insanity due to schizophrenia diagnosis. The sentence: indefinite commitment to Colorado Mental Health Institute. She remains confined over a decade later, with no clear timeline for potential release. Natasha Cornett. Natasha Cornett, Kentucky, Tennessee, April 6, 1997. The crime: mass execution of Jehovah's Witness family, including 2 small children. Cornett became the ringleader in one of America's most notorious family massacres, her daughter of Satan persona, masking a calculated killer who turned a chance encounter into a quadruple murder that shocked the nation. Natasha Cornett styled herself as the daughter of Satan and became the deadly leader of a group of outcast teenagers seeking escape from the poverty and hopelessness of rural Kentucky. What began as a road trip to New Orleans would end in one of the most shocking family annihilations in American history, forever changing how the nation viewed teenage violence and rural desperation. Natasha Cornett was 18 years old in 1997, living in Pikeville, Kentucky, a small Appalachian town where opportunities were scarce and young people often felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Pike County was known for coal mining, poverty, and limited prospects for teenagers who didn't fit traditional molds. Natasha had cultivated an image as a rebellious Gothic teenager, embracing dark symbolism and claiming allegiance to satanic beliefs that shocked the conservative Christian community around her. She wore black clothing, painted her nails black, and dagged mad at and made statements about violence and death that adults dismissed as typical teenage rebellion rather than genuine threats. What made Natasha particularly dangerous was her ability to attract and manipulate other disaffected teenagers who were drawn to her confidence and apparent fearlessness. She had assembled a group of followers who looked to her for leadership and were willing to follow her into increasingly dangerous situations. The group included Crystal Sturgill, 18, Jason Bryant, 14, Joseph Ritzner, 20, Dean Mullins, 19, and Karen Howell, 17. Teenagers and young adults who felt alienated from mainstream society and found belonging in Natasha's alternative family structure. Together, they formed a dangerous combination of youth, desperation, and misguided loyalty. In early April 1997, Natasha convinced her followers to join her on a road trip to New Orleans, promising them freedom, adventure, and escape from the limitations of their small-town lives. The plan was poorly conceived and inadequately funded, but it represented hope for young people who felt they had no other options. The group piled into a beat-up car with minimal money, no clear plans, and unrealistic expectations about what they would find in Louisiana. They had romanticized the idea of starting new lives in a different city, not understanding the practical challenges of survival without resources or support systems. As they traveled through Tennessee on April 6, 1997, their car began experiencing mechanical problems that threatened to end their journey before it really began. The vehicle's failure should have been a minor inconvenience that led them to call for help and return home. Instead, it became the catalyst for one of the most notorious crimes of the 1990s. When their car broke down at a Tennessee rest stop, Natasha and her group encountered the Lillard family, Farr, 34, Delphina, 28, 6-year-old Tabitha, and 2-year-old Peter, who were returning home from a Jehovah's Witness convention in Nashville. The family represented everything Natasha's group rejected: faith, stability, and conventional values. Varied was a devoted father and husband who had immigrated to the United States from Norway, building a successful life through hard work and dedication to his religious beliefs. He approached Natasha's group with genuine concern, wanting to offer assistance to young people who appeared to be in trouble. When Vidor began sharing his religious faith with the teenagers, most people would have politely declined and walked away. But Natasha saw an opportunity that aligned with her antisocial worldview and her group's desperate need for transportation and money. The contrast between the two families could not have been more stark. The little Lids represented love, stability, and hope, while Natasha's group embodied alienation, desperation, and violence. The encounter should have been a brief interaction between strangers. Instead, it became a collision between two worlds that would end in tragedy. Rather than accepting help or declining assistance, Natasha made the decision that would define the rest of her life and end the lives of 4 innocent people. She and her accomplices produced weapons and forced the Lillard family into their van at gunpoint, transforming a chance encounter into a kidnapping. The family was terrified but compliant, hoping that cooperation would keep them safe and allow them to return to their children's bedtime routines and normal life. Vidal and Delfina tried to remain calm for the sake of their children, not realizing that Natasha had already decided their family would not survive the encounter. The kidnapping represented a point of no return for Natasha's group. They had crossed from petty crime and rebellious behavior into serious felony territory, but Natasha was prepared to go much further to avoid consequences and achieve her goals. Natasha ordered the group to drive to a remote location in Bayonne, Tennessee, where she planned to complete her crime away from potential witnesses or intervention. The isolated area provided the privacy she needed to commit murder without immediate discovery. During the drive, the Lillard family continued to hope that their ordeal would end with their release. They likely prayed, comforted their children, and tried to remain positive despite their fear. They had no way of knowing that Natasha had already decided. They were obstacles to be eliminated rather than people deserving of life. The drive to the execution site gave Natasha and her accomplices time to consider their actions and change course. They could have taken the family's money, abandoned them in a safe location, and continued their journey. Instead, Natasha chose murder. At the remote location, Natasha ordered her accomplices to line up the Lillard family along a roadside ditch, a formation that facilitated execution-style killings and demonstrated premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. The positioning of the victim showed that this was calculated murder rather than a robbery gone wrong. Varalid died first, shot while trying to protect his family. Delfina was killed next, leaving their children orphaned and terrified. 6-year-old Tabitha was murdered while her baby brother watched, experiencing trauma that no child should ever witness. 2-year-old Peter was shot twice, but miraculously survived, though he lost an eye and suffered permanent brain damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. His survival provided the only witness testimony to the family's final moments and Natasha's role in orchestrating their deaths. After executing the Lillard family, Natasha and her group fled toward Mexico in the family's van, apparently believing they could escape to another country and avoid prosecution. They had taken personal belongings from their victims, including children's toys that served as grisly trophies of their crimes. The group's flight to Mexico demonstrated their complete lack of understanding about modern law enforcement capabilities and international cooperation. They were captured at the border just 2 days after the murders, found in possession of evidence that directly linked them to the crime. When arrested, Natasha showed no remorse for the murders and maintained her defiant attitude toward authority figures. Her behavior suggested that she viewed the killings as justified actions rather than horrific crimes that had destroyed an innocent family. Natasha's trial became a national sensation as prosecutors detailed the brutal murders, and defense attorneys struggled to explain how 6 young people could commit such heinous crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, including witness testimony from surviving victim Peter Lillard and physical evidence linking the defendants to the crime scene. The prosecution successfully argued that Natasha was the ringleader who had orchestrated the kidnapping and murders, making her the most culpable member of the group despite her relatively young age. Her antisocial beliefs and leadership role in the crimes made her an appropriate candidate for the harshest possible sentence. All 6 defendants received life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring they would never again have the opportunity to harm Innocent people. The sentences reflected society's revulsion at the senseless murder of two small children and their parents by teenagers who killed for convenience rather than necessity. Last day of freedom. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. She remains confined nearly 3 decades later at the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women. Tess Dam. Tess Dam, Colorado, 2007. The crime, manipulation and orchestration of mother's brutal stabbing murder. Dam became a master manipulator who convinced her teenage boyfriend to stab her mother 18 times, then walked free after serving just over a decade, a sentence that continues to generate controversy and outrage. Tess Dam's case represents one of the most calculated examples of teenage manipulation in American criminal history. At just 15 years old, she orchestrated the brutal murder of her mother through an elaborate campaign of lies, psychological manipulation, and exploitation of her boyfriend's devotion, proving that some of the most dangerous predators can hide behind the facade of victimhood and youth. In 2007, 15-year-old Tess Dam had perfected the art of appearing to be the perfect victim of parental abuse. She crafted detailed, emotionally compelling stories about her mother, Linda's alleged cruelty, painting herself as a helpless teenager trapped in an abusive home with no hope of escape. Tessa's lies were sophisticated and psychologically manipulative, designed to trigger protective instincts in the people around her. She described scenarios of physical violence, emotional abuse, and psychological torture that were detailed enough to seem credible but impossible to verify independently. What made Tess particularly dangerous was her ability to identify and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of potential accomplices. She had studied her targets carefully, understanding exactly what motivations and emotions would drive them to commit violence on her behalf. Linda Dam was actually a caring single mother who worked hard to provide for her daughter and maintain their household. While their relationship had typical mother-teenager tensions, there was no evidence of the systematic abuse that Tess described to others. Linda's real crime was being an obstacle to Tessa's desire for complete freedom and control. Tessa's primary target for manipulation was her 17-year-old boyfriend, Brian Grove, a young man who was deeply infatuated with her and eager to prove his love and devotion. Brian represented the perfect combination of emotional vulnerability, physical capability, and willingness to believe Tess's victimization narrative. Over months of careful manipulation, Tess convinced Brian that Linda was a monstrous abuser who deserved to die for her treatment of Tess. She provided increasingly dramatic accounts of alleged abuse designed to enrage Brian and make him feel that violence was the only solution to protect the girl he loved. Tess understood that Brian's protective instincts and romantic devotion could be weaponized against her mother. She positioned herself as a damsel in distress who needed a hero to save her from her tormentor, knowing that Brian would be willing to commit murder to fulfill that role. The manipulation was so complete that Brian genuinely believed he was protecting an innocent victim rather than helping a manipulative teenager commit matricide. Tess had successfully convinced him that murder was an act of love and protection, rather than a horrific crime. Not content with manipulating just Brian, Tess also recruited Jared Smith to serve as a getaway driver for the planned murder. She used similar manipulation tactics with Jared, painting herself as a victim who needed protection from her abusive mother. The recruitment of multiple accomplices demonstrated Tessa's sophisticated understanding of criminal planning and her ability to manipulate different people using tailored approaches. She recognized that having backup support would increase the likelihood of success and decrease her personal risk. Tessa's ability to convince multiple teenagers to participate in murder showed the extent of her manipulative skills and her complete lack of empathy for both her mother and the young men she was corrupting. She was willing to destroy multiple lives to achieve her goal of eliminating Linda. For weeks before the murder, Tess orchestrated every detail of the crime with the precision of a military operation. She studied Linda's schedule, identified the best timing for the attack, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during or after the killing. Tess provided Brian with detailed information about the layout of their home, Linda's evening routines, and the best methods for gaining entry without detection. She essentially provided a blueprint for her mother's murder, ensuring that Brian would be able to complete the task efficiently. The planning phase revealed Tessa's complete emotional detachment from her mother's humanity. She discussed Linda's murder as if it were a practical problem to be solved rather than the destruction of a human life and the betrayal of the woman who had raised her. On the night selected for Linda's murder, Tess implemented her plan with chilling efficiency. She left the back door of their home unlocked to provide Brian with easy access, then positioned herself outside to maintain plausible deniability while directing the attack. When Brian entered the house, he found Linda sleeping peacefully in her own bed, a position of ultimate vulnerability and trust in the safety of her own home. The scene should have triggered recognition that Linda was a harmless woman rather than the monster Tess had described. Instead, Brian followed Tess's instructions and stabbed Linda 18 times in a frenzied attack that reflected the rage Tess had carefully cultivated in him over months of manipulation. The violence was far more extreme than necessary to cause death, suggesting that Tess had successfully programmed Brian to hate her mother intensely. When Brian and Tess discovered that Linda had not died immediately from her wounds, they faced a crisis that exposed their youth and inexperience in criminal activity. Rather than calling for medical help or aborting their plan, they made the decision to complete the murder by moving Linda to the trunk of her own car. Linda died slowly in the trunk, while her daughter and her daughter's accomplices tried to figure out how to dispose of her body. The prolonged suffering represented an additional layer of cruelty that demonstrated Tessa's complete lack of empathy for her mother's pain. The smell of decomposition eventually became overwhelming before they could execute their body disposal plan, leading to the discovery of Linda's remains and the unraveling of Tessa's carefully constructed lies. The physical evidence contradicted Tess's claims of abuse and pointed clearly toward premeditated murder. When police discovered Linda's decomposing body, Tess initially maintained her victim persona, playing the role of a grieving daughter who had lost her mother to unknown killers. Her performance was convincing enough to generate initial sympathy from investigators and community members. However, as evidence mounted and Brian's story emerged, the truth about Tessa's manipulation and orchestration of the murder became clear. Phone records, witness testimony, and physical evidence painted a picture of calculated murder rather than defensive violence. The investigation revealed that Linda had been a devoted mother rather than the abuser Tess had described. Friends, co-workers, and family members testified about Linda's loving relationship with Tess and her dedication to providing for her daughter despite financial challenges. During legal proceedings, Tess attempted to maintain her victim narrative, arguing that her manipulation of Brian was itself evidence of the desperation caused by her mother's alleged abuse. Her defense team tried to portray her as a troubled teenager who had made poor decisions while trying to escape an impossible situation. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Tess had been the mastermind behind a calculated murder plot, using manipulation and deceit to convince others to kill for her. The evidence showed premeditation, planning, and a complete lack of remorse for her mother's death. Tessa eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence that would allow her to potentially rebuild her life as an adult. The plea deal reflected both her age at the time of the crime and the legal system's traditional reluctance to impose maximum sentences on teenage girls. Tess was sentenced to 23 years in prison but was released on parole in 2020 after serving just over a decade behind bars. Her release generated significant controversy with victims' rights advocates arguing that she had received preferential treatment due to her age and gender despite orchestrating A brutal murder. The early release raised questions about whether the justice system adequately addresses cases where juveniles manipulate others into committing violence. Critics argued that Tessa's manipulation skills made her more dangerous than typical teenage offenders, not less deserving of punishment. Last day of freedom, Tess spent her final 3 hours maintaining her facade as a concerned daughter while finalizing murder plans. Final statement: she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder to avoid a longer sentence. The sentence 23 years in prison, released on parole in 2020 after serving just over a decade, sparking controversy about lenient treatment of female juvenile offenders. These 6 cases represent the darkest evolution of female teenage violence in modern history, shattering every assumption we hold about youth, gender, and family bonds. Their crimes force society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil knows no gender, no age, and no boundaries. Unlike their male counterparts, who often explode in random violence, these girls planned, manipulated, and executed their crimes with chilling calculation. They used their perceived innocence as a weapon, their youth as a shield, and their gender as protection from suspicion. Each shattered different sacred beliefs. Sophia Colville, the refugee deserving sympathy, became a killer who beat her grandmother to death. Carly Grigg, the perfect honor student facade hiding a daughter who executed her mother. Scarlett Jenninson, the quiet girl next door who planned torture murder for months. Isabella Guzman, the typical rebellious teenager who became a viral sensation for Matrixide Natasha Connett. The misunderstood goth kid who orchestrated a family massacre. Tess Dam, the abuse victim narrative masking a master manipulator of murder. What makes these cases particularly haunting is how they weaponized trust and exploited the very protection society provides to young women. In a justice system that traditionally shows mercy toward juveniles and females, these cases forced courts to impose adult sentences on children whose crimes were too heinous for traditional juvenile rehabilitation. The stories of these teenage girls prove that evil doesn't discriminate by age or gender. If this opened your eyes to the dark reality of female juvenile killers, subscribe to Women of Crime and drop your thoughts in the comments. Which case shocked you the most? The honor student who executed her mother, the refugee who beat her grandmother to death, or the quiet girl who planned torture murder for months? Share this video because everyone needs to understand that monsters can hide behind any innocent face. Even teenage girls were supposed to protect and nurture. These cases shatter every assumption about youth, family bonds, and feminine nature. Hit the bell icon to never miss our deep dives into the female killers that challenge everything society tells us about women and violence. Next week, we're investigating the Black Widow nurses. Women who use their medical training to become some of America's most prolific serial killers, ending lives instead of saving them. Subscribe to Women of Crime because the most dangerous predators are often the ones you never see coming, especially when they're young enough to be your own daughters.